Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. It's a ritual in many churches, particularly in the Black church. Wednesday night Bible study and prayer service, a time for fellowship and study of God's Word in the middle of the week. Yet this past Wednesday, what was beautiful turned ugly in Charleston, South Carolina, when a lone gunman killed 9 people at the historic Emanuel A.M.E. church. Why did he do it? And what does this mean for race relations in this country? We'll try to make some sense out of a tragedy that defies logic. Another View is next, right after this news from NPR.
Discussing today's topics from an African American perspective, this is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. What happened Wednesday night in Charleston, South Carolina, at the historic Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church is a horrible tragedy, and anyone with a soul has had to search it and question what is going on in this country in terms of race. 9 African Americans, 3 men and 6 women, were shot to death, allegedly by Dylann Storm Roof, a 21-year-old white man. Let's listen to what he told one of the survivors about his reasons for the shooting.
He just said, I have to do it. He said, you rape our women and you taking over our country and you have to go.
We have assembled a panel of experts to try to bring perspective to many of the questions raised by the actions of Roof. Please welcome to Another View Melvin Cotton, pastor of New Genesis Baptist Church in Virginia Beach. Pastor Cotton, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. And Another View favorite, Dr. Eric Claville, history professor and political science professor at Hampton University. He's joining us by phone because he got stuck in traffic over on the peninsula. How are you, Eric?
I'm doing great, Barbara. Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Kay Wright Lewis, assistant professor of African American history at Norfolk State University. How are you, Kay? Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Barbara.
And finally, clinical psychologist, Dr. Stacie Otey-Scott. How are you, Dr. Otey-Scott?
Great.
Good. Thank you so much. So Thursday morning, when I heard all of the details of what happened on Wednesday night in Charleston, I literally burst into tears. And I wondered, just when will the hate stop? And then Thursday night, as I watched all the people coming together at different colors, different ages, and hugging each other and so forth. And then I was lifted a little bit, but then I was kind of like, is it going to stick? And I wonder, Pastor, I want to ask you, is this where our faith takes us, that we hold on to each other because it's just so horrible?
Definitely we have to hold on to the Word of God, and definitely we have to hold on to our faith. I'm reminded that the Bible says that we're not given a spirit of fear, but of love and a sound mind. This situation may have some worried and afraid to go to church, but I encourage all churchgoers and believers to continue to go to church, continue to believe in faith. This is a freak incident that someone did out of hate, and God sees it, and God's going to judge that person.
What was your reaction?
My first reaction was prayer. After I prayed, I thought about what if it was at my church or the church I attend, whether it's New Genesis or Grove Baptist, and it really just hit home, just thinking these type of things happen in the street, various places, and it's been a while since something like this happened in the church. It took me back to those kids in the bombing down south that happened in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. Eric, I know that you're very connected to the church also, and also with your history training, but how did it affect you? What was your reaction?
Well, of course, my heart goes out to all those families that lost, of their loved ones that lost their lives senselessly due to strictly just hate. I mean, that is the bottom line of what took place. Unfortunately, it was a deranged killer and terrorist of people of color that did that. But the first thing that came to my mind was, honestly, unfortunately, I wasn't surprised. I was not surprised. Keep in mind, just 2 months ago, you have Walter Scott, who was shot in the back. Okay, He was murdered by a police officer, who then framed him, tried to frame him by throwing his taser down, and concocted a story which was untrue. All right, that's conspiracy, that's cover up, that's murder. And if you look at the history of South Carolina, especially Charleston, that area, it was an influx of more slave ships during the time of the transatlantic slave trade than any southern port in the United States. So there's talk of the beautiful plantation and antebellum homes that line the coast and so forth. But those homes are built on the backs of importing people as property, okay? So that's the spirit of the place, all right? That's the spirit of that particular place. Every place has a spirit. Every place has a makeup, a DNA. There's some place you go to party, have a great time, Las Vegas, some places that are historical, some places of government. That's the spirit of that place, unfortunately, because of what took place in history. And I want everyone to understand that since the election of President Obama, we've seen an astronomical uptick in what we call hate groups or white supremacist groups, okay? Also, the media and the right-wing media also plays a part in escalating this. Don't forget about Gabby Gifford, who was shot in the head, by, again, another white male, with a gun, saying that we're going to take our country back.
Okay, Eric, hold on one second, because there are so many points you're bringing up, and I want to get to all of that, but I want to let each of the panelists answer the first question, and then I want to circle back around to some of the points that you brought up. Kay, when you first heard what happened, what was your reaction from your personal perspective as well as your professional perspective?
Well, I was disappointed that it was someone that was young. At first I thought, well, he probably doesn't recognize the historical significance of the place in which he committed these crimes. But then after, getting a little more information, I realized that he absolutely did understand exactly what he did. And it was based upon old ideas of white supremacy. So him saying you're raping our women and that you're taking over our country are this very same ideas that supported why slavery should exist, why slavery should continue to exist, why Reconstruction should be dismantled, why Jim Crow was a necessary institution in the South. And so the fact that he's young and he's sort of replicating or holding on to ideas that we had hoped we had sort of transcended is very troubling. And I have to say I fault adults at some level, because obviously we're not, in our ideas of being post-racial or being politically correct, there's not been enough dialogue about race, about slavery, about white supremacy, about the way in which black people have been oppressed violently. The fact that there are 6 females who are killed and 3 males. It's not just black males that have been the victims of white crime. It's also been females, children, old people. And so this was something that was very significant to me, and we need to be able to talk about it, and not just in the framework of it being about gun control. I think that's a distraction that people are more comfortable with, in talking about this issue. What we really need to be talking about is why do these ideas continue, especially in our younger generations, and what we can do about to change that.
Dr. Otey-Scott, your reaction and your thoughts.
Sure.
And move your mic a little bit closer to your mouth. There you go.
Okay. I think initially I wasn't, I want to say I was shocked, but I wasn't. I've been sitting here listening to everybody else's responses, trying to remember exactly how I felt. I think I had to take a step back and think about how I felt about it, because I wasn't as shocked as I would have expected myself to be. I got a text from my mom, and she asked me had I heard, and she, through the text message, was just saying how upset and how disturbed she was and how this has got to end. I think that based on everything that's happened and with kind of this escalating behavior that we're seeing across our nation, with this brutality becoming more and more acceptable, because we're seeing that things are happening with the police, and they're not necessarily being charged. Charges are being dropped. I think that for me, when I saw it, it was more of a, okay, here's something else. It's almost like there was an expectation because there's been this escalation in the behavior. I was very disappointed and then disturbed later to think about the implications of where it happened, and it happening in the church and what that meant, and the fact that the young man sat there and went through a service, and listened to what their beliefs were and what they were talking about, and actually had an opportunity to engage in a little bit of relationship with them, and then he still followed through with his plan of action. I think that's when I started getting a little bit more disturbed.
Mom, I want to ask you, for people who have not experienced Wednesday night service, set a tone for us, because I heard some media folks on one of the broadcasts. They were surprised at how intimate Wednesday night service was. They thought it was the entire church kind of coming together like a regular Sunday service. So for those who have never experienced it, can you paint the picture?
Intimate is definitely a good word to use. There's more dialogue than monologue. It's not like Sunday mornings. People are able to give their thoughts on a particular scripture or text, able to ask questions that they were not able to ask that Sunday morning. Sometimes there are snacks before. Very personal, very personal setting. You can talk to one another. That's how it is at Bible studies.
Okay. I'm doing a little bit of work here because we want to get Dr. Otey-Scott's headset changed so that we can hear her better. There you go. You put that one on. Okay. So it's a very personal thing. Eric, you've experienced that also, being in the church and being a part of the church. When people go to service in the middle of the week, they say it's because they can't wait until Sunday. It's a very dedicated group of people, isn't it?
It is, and some would say that that's where your true believers come to, those middle of the week services. Being a kid of a Pentecostal preacher, we have Bible study at home as well. But those type of services are just as the pastor stated. It's a time period to really get intimate with the Word of God and intimate with your believers and those individuals that are in your congregation, a time period to ask questions, a time period to really pour your heart out. And those individuals make a big sacrifice because we're all busy during the week. But it's a midweek service where individuals say, I still need to get connected with the people of God. I need to get connected with God. I need to get connected to my source. So I'm going to press my way and come there. So I'm pretty sure it was the same at that church as well.
And I'm asking you all to explain that because I'm really trying to get people to understand the parameters around which this happened. And I'm going to ask you, Kay, then to explain some of the history behind the building in which this happened, because I think when you put all of this together, it paints an even more, a stronger picture as to why this was just so horrific.
Yeah, I think you have to start off with the A.M.E. Church was brought to fruition by two formerly enslaved men, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Both of them were enslaved in Delaware. Both of them worked to buy their own freedom, interestingly about the same time in 1783-84. And then Allen is asked by the St. George Methodist Episcopal Church if he'll come and pastor to some of the black congregation there. He's very successful, creates a large number of African Americans, some enslaved, some free, who come. And so then they decide that there's too many of us there, and so they need to build it's a porch, basically, another area in the back for the black parishioners to be. And so that causes a confrontation between Allen and Jones and that church, and they leave and form the Free African Society, which was a mutual aid society. Basically, the mission of that organization was to help newly freed slaves, to help people, widows, people who needed money for burial services, but also sort of as as a meeting place to develop and raise funds so that they could eventually form the first AME church, which was Bethel AME in 1794. Now, because again, Allen is so successful, the Methodist Church starts trying to control him more and more, and he finally gets free from the diocese in 1816. So that brings us to South Carolina, because a person by the name of Morris Brown, he's a free African American. There are about almost 6,000 African Americans there that are enslaved, about 24 free people, and his family is one of them. And so he's working with Allen at that time to help develop this church. And so 2 years later, he forms the Emanuel A.M.E. in Charleston. So the point here is that this is a space, as church always was, whether it was out in the bush, out in the forest, or in secret, the Hush Harbor meetings. It was a place where Black people could find their humanity. It was a place where Black people could see each other and lift the veil, if you will, and practice leadership, have agency. And so it's not coincidental that Dylann chose this place, in my mind, as a site of trying to create a race war or some kind of antagonization between the races, because it's a place where Black agency expressed itself 4 years later in the Denmark-Vesey attempted insurrection, which probably actually began even before that church was formally formulated. Historians say that it was probably in the works for 5 years. Probably maybe as many as 5,000 African American enslaved people were privy to it or part of planning it. And so in response to that insurrection attempt, once it was found out, they burned that AME church down. And of course, all kinds of retribution was exacted against people, and of course Morris Brown was suspected of being a part of it, and there's evidence to suggest that he fully well knew about it, as did other parishioners at that time. So he escapes to Philadelphia and then becomes the bishop of the Bethel AME in Philadelphia in 1832. So the history of that church is one of agency and activism. Post-Civil War, you have Richard Kane. He is one of the first House of Representatives, Black House of Representatives that are elected after Reconstruction. He's also a state senator in South Carolina. So you just have all of these people that come out of that church or are part of that church that are asserting Black agency, and most importantly, asserting that Black people in a very short period of time are able to accomplish amazing things. And so it's a pushback against, when he says, you want to take over our country. Well, that's always been the struggle between, having freedom. What does Black freedom mean? Black freedom means that you're going to take our jobs. That freedom means that somehow we will be, our opportunities will be lessened by your freedom, when in fact Black people always said, well, that's just not true.
As a matter of fact, one of his friends, one of Dylann Roof's friends, talked about hearing him talk about his plan. Let's take a listen to that.
It was a plan. He said that he was planning it for 6 months. It was a race thing because he had told me that it was that the Black people was taking over the country, and that he wanted it to be segregation. I think he wanted something big like Trayvon Martin. He wanted to make something spark up the race war again.
Dr. Otey-Scott, you're a clinical psychologist. When you hear that, I know you can't diagnose him because you haven't had a chance to talk with him, but from a mental health perspective, from a clinical psychologist's perspective, what could possibly be going on in his mind?
I think we're talking about someone who is dealing with a lot of hate. And the root of hate, when you just boil it down to its bare essence, we're talking about something that's rooted in fear. And so you can hear in some of the statements that he's made there's a psychology of hate. But you can hear in some of the statements that he's made some of those specific things that he's pulling out from that psychology of hate, like overgeneralization, and how he's saying things like, you all are raping our women and you're going to take over our country. He may have been exposed to an incident or seen the news, and that can also play a role in how we perceive what's going on in our world. He may have seen a news story about someone being raped by someone black, overgeneralize that about all black people. And then you have to consider the environment he's grown up in. So you take all of that and consider some of the things that he's saying, you put that in the context of what he's done, and it all boils down to hate, fear, and insecurity, being concerned about us taking over the country. There's another component of the psychology of hate that talks about the possibility that it's related to survival, kind of this basic need, like the survival instinct, so that in order for me to survive, I need to make sure that I'm taking care of this perceived threat or enemy who may come in and take over resources. So you all are taking over my country. There's a lot to what he's saying that it sounds very simple on the surface. It's very complex in his thinking. He really boiled it down to this one action where he wants to create this environment where there's this race war. What's interesting in that to me is that in all of the history that we look at where actions are taken like this, what usually happens is just the opposite. You know, we don't come out of this with us being polarized and there being this big race war. Not since the 60s have we lived in that kind of environment. Mm-hmm. We usually come out pulling together as a nation, and it causes folks who may otherwise sit on the sideline and say that's not about me, that doesn't involve me, to see something that's so horrific that they then have to take a stance and say something. And I think we've seen that in South Carolina with blacks and whites and other ethnicities coming together to stand and support and unite and look at what's happened to these families and their community.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. Geraldine joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Geraldine. You're on the air.
Hi, again, this is an exciting show that you always host.
Thank you.
I would like to suggest the man has serious mental health issues. Hate is a form of mental health. This man reflects one person who is totally crazy, out of his mind. I don't think he represents the society as a whole. I think South Carolina is probably a backward place if they still fly the Confederate flag. This and guns. Guns are too obviously available. This crazy person, this person with mental health issues was able to get guns. The fact that he plotted so long just shows me he's terribly mentally health impaired.
Okay.
I don't know how else to say it.
Thank you, Geraldine. We appreciate your call. Kay, you had something you wanted to add?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the thing about the raping of our women is also historic. I mean, in the sense, and has been disproven by historians. Diane Somerville, for example, has written extensively in her book about the black rapist myth. Now, it is a myth. There's no examples out there to suggest that's what he tied up his ideas for why he should kill black people. It's just a myth, a stereotype that's been used to justify white on black crime. So I think that we need to push back hard about that and that resurgence, if you will, of that idea. But also the race war, which is part of the reason I was so excited to come here, is that's the thesis of my manuscript, which traces the history of this idea of race war. So it goes back all the way to the colonial period from contact. And, it's just ironic that that word is still being used. And yes, certainly during the 1960s, black people were pushing back and saying, we're not going to take it anymore. But at the end of the day, pretty much historically, it wasn't blacks inciting a race war. It was whites that threatened to incite a race war and then tying it to black extermination. So I think that there's a number of things that are troubling here. I mean, one of the things with his alignment with the apartheid South Africa, I mean, if you look at the president And P.W. Botha, his total strategy was to eliminate some of the black population in South Africa. He did use biological warfare against his own people, and we're talking about in the 1980s. So, for him to study those things, that's why I'm saying, there needs to be more discussion if we think that, because, it's not rational for people to want to do that or believe that it's necessary. I also push back against the idea that there's something mentally unstable about him, in the sense that if you look at the post-World War II, for example, and all of the lynchings of black people, or even in the Jim Crow era or the end of the 19th century, you have thousands of people looking at black people being hung and lynched and burned up. Are all 1,000 people, do they have mental illness? It begs the question.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about the ramifications of the massacre at Emanuel A.M.E. Church in Charleston, South Carolina, with Pastor Melvin Cotton of New Genesis Baptist Church, Dr. Eric Claville of Hampton University, Dr. Kay Wright Lewis of Norfolk State University, and clinical psychologist Dr. Stacie Otey-Scott. Eric, let me ask you about the point you brought up a little bit earlier about the media and some of the conservative media in particular, and how it also plays into maybe some of the education, and I put that word in quotes, of some of the more radical people who react the way that Dylann Roof reacts.
Sure. And actually, Kay makes a good point, and I want to tie them together. It's really the miseducation of of white America, really, that the conservative media is doing, and others that do this. What Kay spoke about with the fallacies that have been proven to be false deals with white America being miseducated to believe that they are deemed better by birth than black people in America. Period. And it deals with our public policy. The moment the founding fathers and others made those agreements, those business deals, in order to keep slavery as a viable source of economic upward mobility for our country and individuals, they had to support that with public policy that demeaned one race and uplifted another. And it stems directly from that period. Now, how do we look at that moving forward? If you look at when Obama was elected, all of a sudden the conservative agenda was to link everything wrong with America to Obama. That became the new black. That became the new Goldwater time period, where you had code language. When the pastor mentioned, he thought about the Birmingham bombing and the 4 little girls. Mm-hmm. We're still in that time period. It was only suppressed by law that individuals could not act in that way. However, since the emboldening of this population through the media and miseducating these individuals, they found an opportunity to express themselves, express their hatred and their true beliefs in this way. So now when you hear Obama, that's a new word for black, or maybe, and as Richard Sherman stated, who plays for the Seattle Seahawks, he said he believed that thug is simply the new N-word. Okay, So now you attach these code languages, these code words to different statements and so forth, and we see how the media treats these individuals differently. Timothy McVeigh was a terrorist. Period. This guy is a terrorist. The individual that shot Gabby Gifford is a terrorist, and America has to grasp and get into their mind that angry white men can be seen as terrorists, just as we view individuals from the Middle East of color as terrorists.
Okay, let's go to Mark in Norfolk. Hi, Mark, you're on the air.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm enjoying this, and
Thank you.
I appreciate your guest debunking the idea of mental illness, because as your last guest just so eloquently expressed, is that this is an issue that's ongoing, long-going, and we're trying to play nice and make nice with it. And it's nothing nice about racism or terrorism. There's nothing nice about it. And back to what your original guest was saying, when President Obama came into office, all of a sudden, for the first time in my voting life, have I heard people say, I want my country back. So what this young man at 21 years old expressed, and sadly expressed, is a sentiment, an ongoing sentiment in our country. And not that the fact that 9 human lives were lost, that we're going to hug each other and think this thing is going to just evaporate in air. I think we need to adopt the mindset of Eric Holder, our former Attorney General Eric Holder. He said we are a nation of cowards, and he is so correct. And to the pastor, I would love to see our pastors really, really get on a trail and start speaking out against the fact that God hates fear. God expressly says, fear no one or nothing but me. And if we can muster up and understand what it is to live without fear, others will see that lack of fear, and I guarantee you they'll treat us differently.
Okay, Mark, thanks so much for your call. Let's see, Dr. Otey-Scott, I'll let you start, and then I'll let you respond also, Pastor.
Okay. A couple of things. I appreciate Kay for speaking to debunking the myth of the black men being the rapist, and I absolutely agree with that, because people of all colors victimize other people. And what I think that we have to think about with Mr. Roof is that the environment that he was in and some of the things that we have pushed as media in terms of how we're portraying black men and women and men of color, and some of what he may have interpreted from that and then overgeneralized. I think that played into what some of what he is now doing, what he's done. I also think the caller who called in, and Ms. Geraldine, I appreciate her calling in and wants to put this on being related to mental health. I think that absolutely takes the responsibility off of Mr. Roof for what he's done. Hate is not about mental illness. Hate is a choice, just like love is a choice. And so in considering it from that standpoint, this is not about whether he was mentally stable or not. That's a question that needs to be answered. But the fact that he hates has nothing to do with mental illness. And I think that Kay spoke to that very well, too. So I just wanted to come back from a clinical standpoint and make sure that we are not mixing in mental illness and looking at people who truly have mental illness and trying to put them in this same category. It is incredibly different.
Okay. Pastor, in terms of Mark's point.
Well, looking at it from a spiritual perspective, me not being a clinical psychologist, I feel the young man needs God in his life. I hold the Bible to be true. It says, touch not my anointed and do my prophets no harm. The Bible declares, vengeance is mine, thus says the Lord. I think he needs to also seek some type of spiritual help. And speaking in regards to the history, Wednesday night was the night that most slave owners allowed slaves to study the Word of God, those that could read, those that could speak the language well and teach. But the young man needs definitely some spiritual help.
Okay. Reverend Horace Cross joins us from Charlotte, North Carolina. Thanks for calling us. You're on the air.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I was saying earlier that it also means that we have to still do a lot of teaching in our nation. Anytime that a person would make a decision to go to a place and go to a church for the purpose of killing black people, that's a real sad situation. And the person really does need God in his life. But we need to get the word out to the nation that black people are not the enemy. We are regular people. These were people that were going to do what we do in our churches. I'm an A.M.E. preacher. I pastor on the eastern shores of Virginia. And since I was in Charlotte, I had my Bible study on the telephone. But it's every Wednesday night, people are in prayer services throughout the country. And for someone to decide that they're going to a black church on a Wednesday evening, that they know people are there, just to kill them, then we have to do a lot of educating people with race relations, because that's a very sad situation.
Thank you so much for your call, Reverend Cross. We really appreciate that. Let me ask you a question, Reverend Cotton. Have you decided to do anything different in terms of security?
Yes, I have. Coming from where I was to where I'm at, speaking of churches, things are different. We do have a couple people that watch out for certain issues and keep an eye on certain things that I choose not to say over the air. Mm-hmm. So there are people in place, and I will be speaking with more people in days to come.
We also spoke with Reverend Michael Tolliver. He pastors First Baptist Church South Hill, which is in Chesapeake, Virginia. Now, he has a congregation of about 3,500 people, and let's take a listen to what he said about security.
We've already had seminars and workshops with our leaders on what to do when there's an active shooter in the church. But we're going to take it a little bit further. We actually are going to have a drill. Just as in the past we've had a fire drill at the end of a service, on some selected Sunday we're going to prepare our congregation to work with us to do an active shooter drill where we will simulate that there's an occurrence of someone in the church to do harm and make sure that all of the leaders in our church, as well as the individuals who have responsibilities of caretaking for our children, our ushers, and even our security personnel, that they are able to respond in the appropriate way to ensure the safety of our congregants. We believe that the highest priority in any situation or anything that can happen, the highest priority is to ensure the safety and well-being of the people that are here. And so it's our aim to make sure that we put some of those protocols and procedures in place and just make sure that everybody has that comfort level that they are safe.
Dr. Otey-Scott, I saw you shaking your head and going, ooh. I mean, it reminds me of how I feel when I walk into a school and people are walking through metal detectors. I mean, do you really think we might get to a point where we go into the house of the Lord, we have to go through metal detectors?
Well, I think us having to have this discussion is real and it's required, but I think it's also sad. It's a sad commentary to what's going on in our country. I'm employed out at Mount Lebanon Missionary Baptist Church under Kim Brown, and it's rare that you have a clinical psychologist who's on staff full-time at a church. That's incredibly rare, probably even more rare with some of our African-American churches. If they are going to put a policy like this in place, and I understand, some of the reasons why they would see this as necessary, I want to make sure that they're doing some of the other things on the front end to help the congregation understand why they are doing it, and also to make sure they're not increasing the fear and this perception that what's happening is right here at our doorstep and is going to be upon us without us being able to have any control and being able to protect ourselves, but also trusting God to continue to protect us. It's just a sad commentary of where we've come. And in looking at the young man and talking about, Pastor, as you mentioned, the fact that he needs God in his life, there is no doubt that he needs God in his life. But one thing that happens with us, and thinking about it from a Christian perspective, when we come up against hate crimes like this, is that we tend to want to respond in a way that's vindictive. And the Lord's word says that vengeance is mine. I do think that, we have to hold him accountable. There is no doubt about that. But the only way to really conquer hate is through love. And as Christians, that is one of our highest callings. So I'm hearing what we're now getting ready to bring into our church. And I think that if we're going to do that, and I believe there's some reasons why that may be warranted, we have to make sure we're doing it with the right spirit and we're covering all of our bases. We're not just bringing in security and getting this thing set up without saying, okay, you all, let's talk through why we're doing this, and let's go back to who we are relying on and depending on as our source, as the protector.
Mm-hmm. Eric, what's your reaction to that?
Again, I'm a believer in history, in looking at what has taken place. There's nothing new under the sun. Solomon told us that. I believe what was is, what is shall be. With that being the case, what we're seeing now is simply history repeating itself. When individuals, white supremacists and individuals that disregarded the rights of African Americans, they didn't care if you were in church or not. There were many churches burned, okay? Mm-hmm. This is just a repeat of what has taken place before in the past. There's nothing new that's taken place that hasn't been done before, okay? So the measures that we have to go through in order to understand how to make the crooked way right again is what we did before. And we have to work together in solidarity as a group of people, as African Americans, and continue to do what we've been doing, believing in God and keeping our faith intact, at the same time pressuring the government and pressuring society. I talk about the pendulum of justice. The pendulum of justice swings to the extremes. You have one law that says one thing, and then you have a law that breaks that, and it swings to the extreme other side, such as segregation. One day we had segregation in schools, Brown versus Board 2. The next day, segregation ended. However, there were social forces that continue to move that pendulum of justice to the left and to the right, whether they be economic, whether they be others. So we have to push that pendulum of justice with our social indicators and with our solidarity, and push our government and America, and I'm saying America, but I really mean white America, to understand those individuals who do hate in their heart, those individuals that do hate in their heart, that let it go. You know, you were miseducated. It's a fallacy, okay? It's okay to be wrong, all right? The country, not just your country, but our country hasn't gone anywhere, okay? But also I want to make sure the listeners understand something. This terrorist, and I heard even one of the guests call him Mr. Ross or a young man. He's a terrorist, okay? He's a murderer and a terrorist who can be rehabilitated through the grace of God. Yes, he can, Pastor. But he's a terrorist. He killed people. He murdered people, okay? But keep in mind, he said he wanted to start a civil war. Where was the first shot fired of the Civil War? Fort Sumner, South Carolina.
Kay, go ahead.
No, I will just carry on with Eric, because I think, it's important to consider, how we can protect ourselves, within our churches in the future. But I also think we need to pay careful attention to the victims and the survivors of those people, because clearly there had to be trauma, because you're talking about people 87 years old who would have lived through the civil rights movement, who might have lived through Jim Crow, and they know what this is about. This is part of their lived experience. So part of the problem is that this criminal, Dylann Roof, did push a button on for the black community that unless you are black, you can hardly understand what that means, to be, vulnerable to white violence that way. The difference is, of course, he is going to be held accountable. In history, those white criminals were not. But nevertheless, it still pushes a button that creates trauma within the black community. And so I really urge the black church to address that within their own congregations, because it goes beyond just Emanuel
the thing I know that Mother Emanuel right now is a crime scene. So and so people cannot go inside. But I wonder, and any of the panel can answer this, but I wonder when is the right time? And I guess I'm looking to you, Dr. Otey-Scott, because I want from a mental health perspective and Pastor from a spiritual perspective, when is the right time to go back into that church? Because I have a feeling those people are strong. I mean, that church has always rebuilt itself, and they will go back in there and they will rebuild. But how do you do that? What's the conversation that they're having about doing that? What do you think?
Right. People are traumatized to different degrees. And I think that considering the individuals and what their experience of trauma is, and where they're sitting in terms of their desire to kind of re-engage, I think that needs to be taken into consideration. I think that there is a healing that can take place if they are able to go back, when they're able to go back into their church. But I think that you have to make sure that folks have been allowed time to go through the grieving process too, and to process what's happened in this with this trauma. So you don't want to immediately rush into trying to get back to where things were, because they won't go back to where they were. You want to give people the opportunity to grieve, to get some understanding from the trauma, because the healing will actually occur through their process of finding meaning in what's happened. It's while what's happened is devastated, what would be the real travesty is if people walked away from this and just saw this as another injustice, and we don't find the larger meaning for why people have experienced this and what they can now do to heal, recover, and become stronger. So I think that they as a community will have some decisions to make as to how soon they want to go back into the church. And they need to be mindful of people who say that, okay, I'm not prepared, and respect those boundaries for them.
Pastor?
Definitely the grieving process is a factor here. When you go back into certain scenes like that, some people are going to replay where people were sitting, where this happened, start memorializing this seat, and that's not good to have in the church. Definitely my heart goes out to the family, but I don't know if I would be ready to re-enter as a pastor, enter back into such a sanctuary at this moment. The last thing they said in Bible study, the last moment they had here on earth. Yes, a great place to be in the church. However, it was a tragedy.
Eric, I want to ask you, because we got to talk about the flag. We got about 8 minutes, so I know you could take every second of that. But
I won't. I'll try not to.
But I mean, it's such a symbol. The Confederate flag. I've seen it personally. I know that for a lot of African Americans, it is truly an issue and a hard thing to watch. I know that the compromise was to take it off of the state, the actual Capitol building, and move it in front of the building on a flagpole. Your thoughts, and then I'll get to Kay.
Sure. The Confederate flag still flies on Capitol grounds. Okay, yes. It was taken off, as you said, the Capitol building itself, but it still flies there. The Confederate flag, just like the swastika and the flag used for Aryan nations and so forth, represent the same thing. Okay, you have individuals in our country that wanted to break away from the Union because they didn't want to let go of slavery. Okay, the Civil War was about slavery. That's what the Confederacy was about, period. Jefferson Davis, he deputized his vice president in order to write the reasoning or the charter of why they wanted to succeed from the Union. And slavery was part of it. They wanted to keep their tradition. Okay, they had hundreds of years of free labor, of free people, and people they called their own. Okay, these are our property, our people. So when individuals fly that flag, they want to go back to when there was a time period, and we're talking hundreds of years. So what we're talking about is not going to happen overnight to change, but they're talking about going back to a time period that was indoctrinated over hundreds of years, where white males had 100% dominance in this country. Okay, a black person could not say anything against a white male. You couldn't testify against a white male in court. You could not raise your hand at a white male, or you couldn't even raise your hand at their white female. You would be killed on the spot. Dr. Kay talked about lynching. You would be lynched, no matter how educated you were. We have glimpses of that now. Look at Professor Gates at Harvard. His neighbor called the police on him. Okay? It's not that many black people that live in that part of Cambridge where he lives, but the highest educated person of our time, and notable, he had a police call on him. The young man at UVA, he's on the ground. He represents our kids. Educated, on a roll, not belligerent, wasn't a thug, face on the ground, burst, saying, how did this happen? And he came to the realization that at this point in time in our history, no matter what your accomplishments, no matter what you do, you're still viewed with the negativity of a black male that's been indoctrinated in our society over years. But we have to start, okay? And when I say we, I mean white America has to start saying, you know what? This was wrong. We were wrong. We were miseducated. Let's start new.
Okay, Kay, you got about 3 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to sanction that. I mean, we just have to move on. And, just in the same way that as African Americans, we could say, Africans were complicit in the slave trade and enabled Europeans to take 10 to 20 million people out of that country. I understand that. I acknowledge it, but I'm also moving on from it. I still revere the fact that I am from African descent. So just because there were people who fought on the Confederate side of the Civil War does not mean that we have to continue to honor their mistakes. And the mistake is to think that human beings could be perceived as property because they never did perceive themselves as being property. And that's what we have to remember. But I just want to close with saying that, not just the church, not just Mother Emanuel Church, the people there need counseling. Churches all over the country need to counsel people of color and people of Anglo descent about this, because it is something that affects you whether you are there or not, and we really need to make the church, as it always was historically, this space where we could have true and honest conversation.
So in the last 2 minutes that we have, I'm going to get each of you just to say, what is one thing that we can do, Reverend Cotton, to keep people together, to keep that moment that we saw last night where everybody came together, to keep that happening?
I say to the believers, put on the full armor of God, grab hold of the word of God, which is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword. That is our weapon to what is going on now. And if we stay in prayer, that's the most powerful thing we could do as we stick together.
Okay, that's Reverend Melvin Cotton of New Genesis Baptist Church. Thank you so much. Okay, Kay.
Well, I would just say we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in America, a space where people can really honestly talk about their feelings about race and, how that has affected their lives, and just continue that as a dialogue in forums. It could be in universities, could be in churches, but just to continue the individual. We don't need leadership, government, or anybody to do that for us. We can do it ourselves.
Okay, Dr. Kay Wright Lewis of Norfolk State University and Dr. Stacie Otey-Scott.
I think that one of the things we really need to be cautious of is taking on some of the mentality in our response to what's happened that Mr. Roof has taken on. One of the first signs of starting to walk in hate and being able to dehumanize people is when we start disrespecting them and starting to look at him as anything other than a person who has made a horrible decision, who needs to be held accountable for what he's done, starts to border that edge of becoming disrespectful and separating him, and starts that process of thinking of us and them.
Okay, thank you. That is Dr. Stacie Otey-Scott. And Eric, you've got the last 30 seconds.
Last 30 seconds, Barbara. I echo everything that everyone has said on the panel, and I would say that we, as America, need the truth and reconciliation. We need to finally deal with this issue of our past, of slavery, of Jim Crow, of black codes, slave codes, of Reconstruction, and we need to deal with it now. This is our opportunity. This is our opportunity. Let's step up and do it.
Dr. Eric Claville, the history and political science professor at Hampton University. Thank you, my panel, so much. And before we say goodbye today, I want to tell you about an event happening all over the country and right here in Hampton Roads this Sunday, June 21st. In honor of Father's Day, churches and other houses of worship are asking everyone to wear blue and to pray for those who have lost their lives to prostate cancer, and also pray for those who are survivors and thrivers of this disease. Pray for caregivers and clinicians and researchers who are working tirelessly to find a cure. 1 in every 5 African American men in the U.S. is diagnosed with prostate cancer. Early detection is critical for survival, so remember to get that PSA test, men. And if you are diagnosed with prostate cancer, learn your treatment options and understand that not all men will need immediate treatment. If you'd like to learn more information, call the Hampton Roads Prostate Cancer Forum at 757-827-0488. There's a lot said in today's program, so if you'd like to listen to it again, go to our website, anotherviewradio.org, and download the podcast. Next week, it's Another View on Health with Dr. Keith Newby. We're talking about bariatric surgery. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Victor Bowen is our audio engineer, and Kamaria Mason answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Happy Father's Day to all the dads who are listening, especially my daddy, Charles Ham. And happy anniversary to my husband, Maxie Lee. 7 years this Sunday, y'all. Make it a fabulous weekend, everyone. And let's get together again next Friday at noon for Another View.